Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Ben Kinsley is joining me. Ben's from Campaign for Vermont. And our guest host today, guest star tonight is Chris Cole, who is the Commissioner of Buildings and General Services. And I have a definition of building and general services, just in case you weren't sure.
Let's see if it matches mine.
It says, which exists primarily to provide the facilities and services required for all state agencies and departments to accomplish their mission. So we all relied on buildings and general services. Welcome.
Thank you, Pat.
Yeah. How
Chris,
many
thank you for being
years
here.
do we go back?
I first met you in 1998 when I joined the legislative staff as a fiscal analyst for transportation, and you were the DMV commissioner.
That's right. And you had both House and Senate.
I did.
Yep. Very good. Excellent. Very good financially. That's got his numbers down. But you came from New York, and that role was a little different there, I remember, because you were actually involved in policy in New York in the similar, which we don't do here, right?
So New York is a little different structure in how they do their legislature. It's pretty similar to Washington, D.C. in terms of staff control of the policy process, and less on the members. It's very centralized between whoever the President Pro Tem of the Senate is and whoever's the Speaker of the House. They really make the calls with the leadership and staff implement.
You were a great asset to Dick Pembroke and Dick Mazza, the two guys.
Well, he's been chair of, Mazza's been chair of Senate Transportation for forever. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yep.
So we always ask our guests to talk a little bit about themselves, and you've got a laundry list of awesome things you've done.
So I moved to Vermont in 1994 after going to high school in Vermont at Vermont Academy in Saxton's River. Graduated in, 1978. And I ended up marrying a Vermont girl, which is ultimately what brought me back to the state I went to high school in. And my first professional job was a legislative analyst for the New York State Assembly, and I did K through 12 education policy, I did transportation policy, and I did environmental conservation policy. And then we moved to Vermont in '94. We moved to South Hero, and I stayed home for 4 years to take care of my two boys. And then I had quintessential Vermont jobs. I milked cows at the dairy farm across the street. I picked apples and did school tours.
Wow.
I did a startup newspaper business, which I got up off the ground. And I ran for school board and was elected, and I also coached the middle school basketball team.
Good for you.
So I got really involved in my community, really learned about Vermont and what people cared about in Vermont, at least in my community, South Hero. And then job opened at the Vermont legislature. I applied, I was accepted. I worked there for 3 years for the transportation committees. Then I was offered a position as the general manager for CCTA. I had a transportation finance background, a transportation policy background, and they really needed help with finance and policy, so it was a good job, good fit for me. And I learned how to be a leader of an organization and an operating entity.
And I was Secretary of Transportation. No, I think it was Secretary. And I wanted Chris, and we pushed for this a lot, to really be in charge of all of the public transit entities in Vermont because the schedules weren't matching. It was all kind of a hodgepodge.
Well, you still have some of those issues where not all the schedules match, and
yeah, because I thought he would be the best, but we weren't very successful. We tried though.
So
I was supportive.
I did under your leadership and support. We did take over or combine a bunch of small rural transit agencies with the organization CCTA. So it now provides transportation to 50% of Vermont's population.
I didn't know that. Good for you, because that just made so much sense to me.
Well, and the big one a couple of years ago was the CCTA and GMTA merger, right? That happened a couple of years ago.
So that was my last official action as the general manager at CCTA. I created with the board's assistance and staff's assistance to CCTA a separate organization, not-for-profit, called GMTA. And then we added the rural agencies as they were looking for support. And then my last official act as general manager was legally putting the two organizations together under one umbrella.
I was on the GMTA board for quite a while, and the bus route you've got is very popular.
Yes.
Between Montpelier and Burlington.
Montpelier and Burlington and St. Albans and Burlington and Middlebury and Burlington are all very popular routes.
Because we talked for years about multimodal and blah, blah, blah. And
Yep.
just never seemed to...
So then from CCTA, when Governor Shumlin was elected, Secretary Searles invited me. I had met him originally in 2000, and he invited me to be part of his team to do policy, and so I joined and did policy for 4 years, and then he retired, and Sue Minter was elevated to secretary, and I was asked to be deputy secretary.
Perfect.
I did that for 9 months, and then when Sue Minter left to run for governor, I became the secretary.
Excellent. And now?
Now, Governor Scott came into office and offered me an excellent opportunity to stretch myself in my policy area and operational area. Now I'm the Commissioner of Buildings and General Services for the state of Vermont.
I was going to ask this question later on, but you said in an article that this was the most difficult and maybe the most rewarding job, I don't know, but that you've had in state government. Why is that?
Well, the question was asked of me, is this a more difficult job than your most recent job, Secretary of the Agency of Transportation? And I indicated that it was a more difficult job just because of the variety of subject matter you have to become an expert on. So at Buildings and General Services, we manage buildings, as the name obviously implies, and there's 5 different units that deal with buildings. There's Office of Security, which provides security to buildings. We have the Office of Energy, which seeks to reduce energy costs in buildings. We have Design and Construction, which does all the capital projects. We have Operations and Maintenance, which actually takes care of the buildings, cleans them, fixes them. And then we have Property Management and Planning, which does planning projects for the buildings and also maintains our inventory of leased buildings, because we don't own all our buildings. We have about 238 buildings we own and about 120 leases for lease space across
Where
the
does
state.
purchasing and contracts fit in amongst that?
Purchasing and contracting is
that's always a hot button.
Is outside of the buildings part of it, and it's in the general services part of it, but we do have an Office of Purchasing and Contracting. Our contracting rules can be challenging to follow from folks outside of state government. I've been told we're hard to do business with, and I'm accepting and eagerly going out and meeting people to talk to them. One of the initiatives I'm going to be working on is engaging the public in different sectors as to how our contracting process could be more user-friendly. I've already met with a couple of different associations, Association of General Contractors. We met with an association of IT companies to make IT procurement easier for them. So that is a touchstone
Good for you.
area I have to take care
That's
of.
always a hot button.
It is.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Bulletin 3.5. It's
Bulletin
like,
3.5.
ooh.
Yeah, exactly. The state contracting practices is always seems to be under the gun. So generally speaking, though, BGS, Buildings and General Services, is responsible for providing office space for all of the state workforce, is essentially what it is.
We are, so the Department of Buildings and General Services is located in the Agency of Administration. State government in Vermont is organized around departments embedded within agencies unless you're a standalone department. If you're a standalone department, you report directly to the governor and the governor's chief of staff. So Department of Labor, Department of Public Safety, those are standalone departments. I'm a department that's embedded within an agency. And generally, all the departments within the Agency of Administration support the functioning of state government. So, you know, if you think about what the state of Vermont is and what Governor Scott has done, which is to catalog all the programs in the state, which had never been done before, because you have multiple programs coming from different departments that may support the same thing. And in this program exercise of identifying programs, they identified that we have 67 different programs on workforce development, which is why the governor has a focus on workforce development and why he's brought in people recently to start making sense of this, so we can not have individual siloed programs, but working together to meet our objectives to support the economy and to get more people back into the labor force. And so, you know, we also have within you know, so we support programs, and programs need building space in order for people to work. And the buildings that we provide support for, you know, our state laboratories. We're just finishing up a project on the blood lab at the Department of Public Safety. It's a critical piece of infrastructure. So from our perspective, we're building something, but what that something's going to be used for is to test drivers on the road. And I know you have history with this, drivers on the road who, you know, are impaired. But are impaired with different substances other than alcohol that we need to check. So that's just an example of a small little project that we worked on.
That's a hot issue these days.
But it's absolutely critical. So that's what we do. We support programs by giving them the space and the tools they need to do their work. The governor just did a groundbreaking on the Vermont Agriculture and Environmental Lab at Vermont Tech in Randolph. We did that last week, and that's a critical program for water quality, to understand the phosphorus contents in our lakes and rivers.
God, you're involved in everything. That's an equally hot topic as the lake
well,
water.
this is why, you know, I did indicate that it's a challenging, more challenging, because in transportation, you know, you have roads and bridges, and you got public transportation, rail, and aviation. That's it. Right. And they're all little things within there. You know, you've got the DMV and you've got the Commercial Motor Vehicle Enforcement and all of this stuff, but it's all focused on transportation. When we work at BGS, we have to get into the specifics of the programs in order to understand what their needs are so the facility we're building can reflect those needs. And so you have to actually learn about all the other programs.
You do, I must say, they'll have a great staff.
Oh, I have an excellent staff.
I knew some of, they're not there anymore, but just the whole culture of buildings. They're hardworking, smart, and boy, do they know what's going on.
And they can get stuff done.
They don't ask, just don't ask.
Done. All you have to do is mention it in a sideways conversation, and all of a sudden something is completed. You know, they work very hard, and that was one of the real joys when you go to an organization. One of the things you're always wondering about is the culture of the organization and how they approach their work, and it's exactly as you indicated.
Exactly.
I was
and it's always been that way, and it's just a built-in culture, regardless of people coming and going. There's this quality and dedication that's right there. So
they have the #1 ingredient that I look for in every employee. They actually care.
Yeah, they do. Good point.
Well, and it's interesting because, you know, no one praises you know, BGS when a new lab is built, right? That's not. So it's all this work that you're doing to support other parts of state government. I think oftentimes flies under the radar. Like people don't see that.
It does, but I've never been a person, and our people in our organization are not looking for the spotlight. You know, we work behind the scenes to make things happen. We know how things get done, and
they're so
it's just important that we know.
So easy to work for, and they all know your name. I mean, because I've been around forever, but everybody knew my name. I knew their name, knew about their families and stuff. They didn't want anything to happen to me, as I didn't either. So they would always watch out if I was staying over or coming in on the weekends, and nice group.
They get to know their customers.
Yeah, and I don't know how. I have to tell you, when I see some of those 1,000 people on the lawn, and they put up the microphone, they get it all done. It's all perfect. I've never had a problem ever in any event.
No, so I'm really learning about their capabilities. I've been in the job for a year, and the Christmas tree lighting ceremony this year.
The logistics behind lighting a Christmas tree.
And then what if it didn't work?
Who knew? I mean, there's a lot of logistics behind that. And the tree this year was especially beautiful and had a poignant story attached to it. But it was large, you know, and we had to fit it into the hole just right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they're a good group. Anyway, so you have one thing that I wanted to talk about, and I actually read the Capitol bill. You are responsible for presenting the Capitol bill to the governor, are you not? And then he writes a cover letter and sends it to the legislature and this year was $12 million proposed, and on his cover letter, which I thought was interesting, of all the stuff you have in the bill, he highlighted adult tech centers, good for him, Middlebury's secure residential facility, mental health. oh, Middlesex, right? I'm reading it, looking at it, and that's what it says, Middlesex. Vermont Clean Water Initiative, and stormwater runoff, and obviously stuff that's needed for our state buildings. So he really pinpointed the things that are of importance to him. How does that capital bill get put together? Because everybody needs something, if not more than something.
It gets put together with active involvement from the governor. So the governor is very involved in the decision making, that what are the priorities of the capital bill, and what priorities is he trying to achieve, and then he directs staff to develop proposals to meet his goals. And so he's fairly clear, and has been very clear since the moment he offered me the position what his goals are. And his goals are to grow the Vermont economy, to make Vermont more affordable, and to protect Vermont's most vulnerable. And he has
I love it that every commissioner can say that. Everybody we've had, I think it's great.
He has a laser-like focus on these issues, and because he does, it transcends to all of his appointed staff. Yep. And when I'm looking to my staff, so when I marched into the job, and my very first week on the job, I gave the staff the governor's 3 priorities, and I said, let's address the affordability issue. Making Vermont more affordable is also about keeping more of the money in Vermonters' pockets that they earn, which means that we as state government have to be more efficient. So I want efficiency proposals from all of you at the end of the week. And I had one in my office the next day from the fleet manager who had a 5-point proposal on how to make the fleet program more efficient and save even more funding.
Wow.
And the governor asked to see it before the cabinet. I brought her to the cabinet meeting, and she unveiled it, and the governor endorsed it right away. And so he is involved, and he's actively looking for efficiency ideas to make government more affordable for Vermonters. And so I think, sometimes people will cite his 3 goals as a weakness, but it's quite the reverse.
Oh, I don't think so at all.
It's quite the reverse. It actually empowers his staff to make decisions, and his appointees to make decisions that meet those 3 goals.
Yeah. I was rather impressed. We had interviewed the governor, and he was very adamant about those goals, and said he was expecting everybody to know them, and every meeting it's focused on those 3 goals. You can, in state government, you can go off the track a little bit pretty easily.
You can, which is why it's important to have goals. How we reach those goals is a matter of debate between the governor and the legislature, but those goals he's not wavering on. Right. Those are the critical things that we need to achieve to make our state function.
Good for him.
Yeah.
That's good. Oh.
So, there's a bunch of things in the capital bill every year. This year's bill is $12 million, at least right now. It could change between now and the end of the legislative session. What's not in there, though, is this new prison proposal in St. Albans. The governor had rolled out 3 weeks ago. Is that, and that's a mix, in my understanding, of both private and state funding. Do you have any involvement in that project, or how does that working?
So the legislature last year requested that Secretary Gobay and myself deliver a report to them this year, and they delineated a variety of populations they wanted us to serve. So it was people who were incarcerated, it was mental health, it was juvenile treatment, and there were different populations within the mental health treatment. And they wanted a long-term vision. And so what Secretary Gobay and his team delivered, and our role in it is providing the estimates for the space that they need to deliver their programs. And so as he worked with it with his team, it became apparent to them, based upon their experience in operating mental health facilities as well as corrections, that greater efficiencies of service could be achieved by co-locating onto one campus a variety of these different programs. And so that was where they landed, is to provide mental health services as well as correctional services, as well as mental health services in corrections to all these targeted populations. They selected northwestern Vermont because that is where there's a greater likelihood to find mental health professionals. Those are hard positions to fill.
Yeah.
And so that was the genesis of that location. The proposal, the report that was issued really has two tracks. One track is this long-term proposal to build a campus facility potentially over time or at once. So the proposal doesn't advocate for a public-private partnership. It doesn't advocate for doing it the Capitol bill. It states we can do both. We can do it the traditional way, phasing this in over time till we get to 2028 when it'll be fully built. And we can do that out of the Capitol bill and go through the normal RFP process that we do in Vermont. Or if we wanted to build it all at one time and realize those operational efficiencies by pulling back the out-of-state prisoners, which the governor wants to do as well as the legislature wants to do, and to build a more modern facility that has reduced operating costs over the life of the project, over 20 years after it's built, we would save $100 million or $5 million per year in operating costs and have enhanced facilities to meet these targeted populations. You know, now it gets handed to the legislature. So that's the long-term vision. But what he did put in the Capitol bill is his short-term vision. So we have an immediate need in Vermont for forensic beds. And forensic beds are for people who are in the custody of the commissioner of the Department of Corrections. And so these are folks who have entered the facility being put there, and they're big F and little f as they talk about it. And the forensic beds that are little f are people who, because they were incarcerated because they committed a crime, later the corrections department finds out that they may have mental health issues.
Right.
And so, and they need to be treated in a hospital-like setting. And so the short-term proposal he has is it's $2.9 million in the Capitol bill to do a forensic bed unit of 12 beds in the Northwest State Correctional Facility. And that is to relieve overcrowding at the state facility, the state psychiatric facility in Berlin, where we have forensic people now, but they really shouldn't be there. We have two populations now.
Two populations there.
And there's tensions because of it. And so we would really like to move those forensic people out and then backfill those positions at the state psychiatric hospital for people who aren't under the custody of the Department of Corrections, but under the custody of the Department of Mental Health.
Yeah.
And then,
I see.
and then the other investment he wanted to make was the secure residential. So these are people also under the Commissioner of Mental Health, not corrections, but they need to be in a facility that's secure and is residential, because that's where they're staying. Average length of stay is about a year until they can get stabilized and go back into society with other treatment supports.
It's a real problem in the hospitals.
Yeah, I was going to say that
everywhere.
in hospitals.
It's all interrelated,
Yeah.
and it all backs up. And so he and his staff have identified that one, the facility in Middlesex was temporary. We need to find a permanent location, and that's a priority. The other is the forensic beds, which is going to assist with this backup into the emergency rooms.
I probably shouldn't ask you this. I should ask Al Gobay, Secretary Gobay, but are they backing away from the plan from last year, the year before, to obviously not have one big mental health like we had in Dale, but to have separate units around the state?
The hub and spoke
The
program.
hub and, yeah, because
That is a question for Secretary Gobay.
Oh, okay, I will, because, good answer. I just think, because you mentioned it before, you don't have the specialty people, the people who specialize in mental health. We don't have enough of them, I don't think, to adequately staff the facilities around. And if you have the one facility like Dale or in corrections, you could figure out a way to staff them with the quality people you need.
Well, the other issue is a funding issue, because it was partially a federal change in the 80s that drove that move away from the centralized location to a hub and spoke program.
Right.
And we just never adequately funded.
Because
So
I know the hub and spoke is well received outside the state. People are very interested in it, and to a lot of people it seems like it's a success. I just have my own.
With Vermont, we're always looking to maximize federal participation in our programs. So we tend to follow the federal rules, and for institutes of mental disease, where you have beds more than 16, Medicaid won't pay. And so we really need to keep our facilities at the 16 level, which gets to your point about more of a community-based service model. And so we're going to need to watch that. Right now, Vermont does have a waiver. We're the only state in the country that has a waiver for IMD.
We must do something right. They keep giving us waivers.
We're very creative. But they've also signaled that this waiver is going to run out in 2026. So
because the hospital here has what, 25 beds? It's got more than 16.
It does.
And that's the waiver that's going to expire, right?
Oh,
in
is it really?
2026.
Oh, ouch.
Yes.
Yeah, so they're going to lose funding for that facility.
Unless we downscale it to a 16 bed. And then Secretary Gobet has a bunch of other ideas that would address that issue, because if you have a mental health facility as part of a hospital, they're really looking at 50%. So if you're more than 50% substance abuse treatment and mental health treatment, you're above 50% of the population you're serving, then you're an IMD and mental health Institute of Mental Disease. If you're below the 50%, then you're just a regular hospital and the Medicaid funding can flow.
Oh, I see. Wow.
And so he has a lot of things to weigh. And this report that he developed puts all this information at the legislature. And so they're busy digesting it and understanding all of the implications, because it's not only capital expenditures, it's also operating expenditures.
Sure.
And you really, operating is the ongoing support that state government has to provide to programs. And so we need to make sure we're maximizing our federal partners' involvement and we're saving as much operating. So we never plan buildings independent of understanding what it's going to cost to operate them and where is that money going to come from.
Well, I give you both a lot of credit, because that was a great report, and it was done in fairly short time. So little work on your part, I would think.
Secretary Gobet really marshaled his staff, and they really dug in and focused on it. He's provided them with a report, and as I've heard Secretary Gobet several times say, this is the beginning of a conversation.
That's great. Good
So here's the $1 million question then: is which plan, paying for it up front or paying for it over the next 10 years, which one costs less from an operating standpoint?
We'd have to go through those numbers, because you'd have to offset. I mean, when we build something with capital funds, we're paying interest anyways. And so if somebody builds it without capital funds, what's the interest that they're charging us, and how does that compare with the general obligation bonds?
The RFP process, right? You're going to open it
up.
Well,
and how does that also compare to the $5 million you're saving?
Exactly. So when you phase in, if we did it under the capital bill, you'd be phasing in those. So you'd be closing one prison, and then you'd be opening, a suite of another. So that analysis hasn't been done yet.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Yeah. So just sort of talking about buildings, I noticed in an article I read that you had an issue at St. Johnsbury. It's the sick building syndrome, and you've had your one experience, I guess, with chemicals impacting air quality. Because we have had over the years, I mean, just one after the other. Bennington, I was involved in one at DMV, and there's always something going on. How do you prevent a sick building syndrome, and do you have, what do you have on staff to help you? Do you call on the health department?
So we own 238 buildings. We lease 120. Of those 120 buildings that we lease, they're all primarily in downtowns in Vermont, and because downtowns in Vermont went through the Industrial Revolution, and
Talking old.
talking old, and you're talking environmental practices that wouldn't be practiced today. And so therefore you could go to pretty much any Vermont community and dig in the soil and find some contaminants.
Right.
When I became commissioner, I can't recall how this came to light. There was some indoor air quality tests, I think, is it related to potential mold contamination. And during that process, we discovered that there were levels of contaminants from an old dry cleaning facility that was either on that location or adjacent to that location. And the levels were higher than the Department of Health standards for exposure to infants and women who were pregnant, but less than the VOSHA standards for indoor air quality. But in an abundance of caution and care for our employees, we decided that it was important to move them out of the building and into another space. So we were fortunate to find another space, and they're in this new location, which
you have to move quickly if there's once it's been identified.
Right.
So this was my first emergency at BGS. I've done a bunch of emergencies at VTrans, but had never done an emergency at BGS, and it's really all hands on deck. And we went to St. Johnsbury. We had a meeting with all of the state employees. We told them exactly what we knew, what we had found, what the potential issues were, and then we had a plan to find them a new building, which we did. We signed a 5-year lease. We'll be evaluating what we want to do in St. Johnsbury. I mean, we have a goal of locating our Agency of Human Service district offices in downtowns. That's where the clients are, and that we're not. We are observant to the fact that when we locate a state office building in a community, it provides an economic ripple effect for that community. It's one of the reasons why Waterbury was fighting so hard to have state offices return there after the complex was flooded out. And so I think the town of St. Johnsbury would prefer we moved back into downtown. So
there's a lot of employees, a lot of departments are up there.
Yes.
It's quite a few. I don't know what the number is, but there's quite a few state employees in St. Johnsbury. So I can see what impact they would have on the local businesses, restaurants, and stores. And stuff.
We still have some people downtown, but we moved the main bulk of the district Agency Human Services office just next to the interstate exit.
Is Waterbury completed now? Speaking of disasters, and
it isn't. We're currently working on the Weeks building. And then the Hanks building will come next. We have money in the capital bill this year to demolish Stanley.
Oh, no kidding. Stanley Hall?
Yeah. And
lots of meetings there in Stanley Hall.
To demolish that, and then the plan is to begin the scoping work and design of a new Wasson. So Wasson is the building which is historic, which we can't demolish. We're going to refurbish that, and then that's going to be part of a larger design that's going to bring back 250 state employees back to the Waterbury State Office Complex. That section of the complex would be the last portion of the complex that could be built out.
Good.
The rest of it can't be built out. And then we want to bring back AHS employees from leased space in Chittenden County. This would be less expensive for the taxpayers over the long haul. We have people at the Global Foundries plant in lease space. We have people in Williston at Hurricane Lane in lease space. And so we want to start bringing people back to Montpelier. We also have to look, Waterbury. We also have to look at the space in downtown Burlington. We have a big office building in downtown Burlington, which the state owns, but it's part of an area of the city that the city is redeveloping with that large mall.
Yeah, it's right next to the redevelopment project.
Yep. Yeah. And so it's you know, and we've had some inquiries about whether we'd be willing to sell our state office building. So we're going to go through that process. Not everybody in that state office building provides services to individuals downtown, and so we'll be looking at those issues as well. Whether we keep them in Chittenden County, whether we keep them in Burlington. You know,
Keep
these
you
are all
busy
things.
for a while.
All of these
You got
things
people
in
in Barrie?
buildings. It's a chessboard.
Yeah,
It really is a chessboard, and every time you make a move, there's another move that has to
Right.
fill
There's
in.
there's something
that
else.
Because I
space.
always wonder how the setup and the cost of moving setup. Sometimes they need new furniture, new walls or whatever those partitions are called, and just setting up the IT could be huge dollars.
I also have responsibility for state surplus.
Well, there you
and so,
we love state surplus.
So we can
All of those cars that
I
you buy.
love it. Yes.
we find stuff.
Stuff.
And we can refit offices.
Where is state surplus these days?
It's outside of Waterbury. It's west of Waterbury, right next to the Sun Common building.
Oh,
So
I
there's
know
a
where
couple
that is.
warehouses
okay.
right to the right.
It used to be down the street from me because
Yep.
if you come to my office, you'll see it's all state stuff. It's great buys.
When I first moved to Vermont, as I was explaining to you, and I was milking cows, when we needed something like office furniture or something, I would go to state surplus
Yeah,
and
it's great.
see what they had. And Vermonters are welcome to go to state surplus. Things that find its way to state surplus, we've made a decision that the state of Vermont can no longer repurpose this
Right.
issue.
There's some complication with the federal pile of stuff, but
We sell federal surplus items as well on
Right.
behalf of the state of Vermont. We were able to take 2 hybrid vehicles that the federal government made available to us for free, and we repurposed them to the state college system.
oh, cool. That's great. Good for you.
It's cool stuff.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of different things, but back in June, the auditor put out a report that highlighted some things in BGS that could be improved. I think you were fairly new on the job at that point.
Yep.
And we actually had the auditor on the show about a month or so ago, and we were talking about this and some other things that he had done, and you kind of took that as constructive criticism, I guess, or constructive feedback, and ran with it and said, yeah, let's make some changes. And I think one of the things that he said is, the auditor said, was that he was very impressed with how your department had turned around and received the feedback and then acted upon it almost immediately.
You have it on video if you
Yeah, if you want to
if you want to use it.
Exactly.
He pretty much said the same thing to me. So when I had my first audit, it's when I went to CCTA, and an audit is just a report card of how you're doing. You know, just like you got into school. You know, you got a C or a D from your teacher, and that was something that you needed to work on to improve.
Right.
And that's all an audit is. It just tells you about areas of your organization that you need to work on. And the one rule of auditing is if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. And so a lot of the audit from the auditor was a lack of documentation by BGS on how and why we make decisions. And a lot of it was in the change orders. He didn't understand why certain change orders happened in the process. And the project manager could recite chapter and verse every element that needed to be changed and why they needed to be changed in that project. Sometimes it's differing site conditions, whatever it is, but it wasn't really documented that well, or if at all.
Gotcha.
And so it was just verbally them explaining. But to an auditor, that isn't a well-run organization because you can't use the documents to improve yourself.
Right.
Which I intuitively understood from having gone through audits for years, but the staff was a little different because they felt and they were doing a good job. They were doing a good job.
So it wasn't for that they weren't trying. Right?
No, and they work really hard. They have more projects than sometimes is humanly possible to manage, and they were able to respond and provide answers for everything.
Right.
But in audits, it's all about documentation. What is really instructive to me was when I went into the House Corrections and Institutions this session, the very beginning of the session, and because we didn't have an opportunity to talk about the audit report last year because they were so busy with the Capitol bill, and I had mentioned it to the chair, so we brought in a presentation on what we have done at BGS since the audit report came out, and Deputy Commissioner Jennifer Fitch has been leading that effort of continuous improvement and creating things. So, but what the chairwoman of the House said to her committee is she went through each of the 10 projects that the auditor had researched, done an audit on, and virtually all of them, the reason they were delayed was because of the legislature. You know, Irene happened, and in order to make space for some of those projects, they delayed other projects so they could pull the Irene projects in and use the money on those. And and you know, that perfectly justified. But she wanted to make sure her committee understood that, you know, the underlying reasons of why projects are delayed. What I didn't dispute in the audit report was the lack of documentation and the lack of process in the department. And so we've been working really hard on that. You know, we came from a larger agency. The deputy commissioner also came from VTrans, and we're used to a defined.
Who's the deputy commissioner?
Jennifer Fitch.
She
was a engineer in the Accelerator Bridge program, and I had worked with her in the department in a variety of capacities. Found her to be very ambitious, very energetic, very smart, and that was the type of person that I needed at BGS to drive all of the improvements forward. So she runs the department on a day-to-day basis and makes sure that everything is going forward. And I find when I've taken chances on people who are hardworking and they rise up really quickly and take a lot of responsibility for what they do. So I like putting people in those positions who are eager to make a mark for themselves, and she's doing that.
Very cool.
Well, we enjoyed the auditor, and I was very impressed with him, because I'm sorry he doesn't have more authority, because sometimes people just don't pay attention. And in fact, I think he's really there to help. And in past we've had auditors who are more political and use that information, perhaps, and you're dodging headlines in the Burlington Free Press. But I think he's genuinely there to help. I would go to him if I was working to ask for help, because I don't think you read about it the next day in the Burlington Free Press.
You know, I think if you approach the audit with the auditor with what his goals are, which is to improve the performance of your department,
right,
and you go in it with that attitude, there are certain things we're not going to agree with, and that's perfectly fine. But the overall message is, you know, as a leader of a state department, you have to be receptive to the criticism and the lack of documentation to support your processes and your decision making.
Well, and it's also to protect your employees too, because you've got the written proof of how things went, and it's not what's in their mind necessarily.
Someone leaves and someone else comes in, they can pick up, and they have the documentation of here's what happened in this process.
So here was his point on change orders. You know, we didn't have a documented process to record all the reasons why we do change orders. You know, a change order occurs when you have a contract with a contractor, and something needs to be done for the project that is outside of the scope of work. So now you need a change order, and they're going to get paid extra money. But we're making a decision that says, yes, we need this. This is going to enhance the quality of the overall building project that we're doing.
But there's always concern about scope creep, right?
There is.
How you do that, and
so
the cost goes up and up.
We came up with a good proposal for scope creep in a project we have going on at 111, which is the Supreme Court building, is going to be the first project that gets this scope creep treatment, which is they're going to sign a scope of work document along with the commissioner of BGS. It's going to be an agreed to scope of work. This is what
That's great.
This is what it's going to entail, and so that as the project goes along, when typically scope creep will occur, we will point back to the document and indicate.
Because that holds the contractor as well to what was agreed upon, because somehow they just, we'll just ask for an amendment to the contract.
So the auditor's point was, how can you reduce the number of change orders that occur in a contract if you're not documenting the reasons for the change orders?
Right.
And so, he wasn't wrong. And so once you document all those reasons, over time you're going to build up a body of knowledge so that For example, when we were doing the Westminster Police Barracks, we did borings of the soil to ascertain what is the soil quality, and that informs your judgment on where you're going to put the facility, you know, the type of underlying soils, and we did an appropriate number of borings, and turns out there were 2 underground fuel tanks on that property that we didn't know about and didn't come through with the deeds, and we found out about them as we were under construction. Those are unforeseen site conditions that now you have to have change orders.
Serious.
And you have to figure it out. You have to do soil testing, and you've got to
back
excavate
before they
those.
tracked things like underground fuel tanks.
Exactly.
Yes, and so
Explosion.
that's something that is a good example of why you would want to document that change order to understand. So if you have a lot of change orders that are coming in from unforeseen site conditions, then it's leading to a conclusion that maybe you ought to be doing more borings or maybe other things to reduce those
Good for
unforeseen
you.
site conditions.
I hope that's successful and others take advantage of your example, because scope creep is an issue.
It is. Oh, it is an absolute issue.
For the contractor too, just to
Well, it's, you know,
get their mind. We don't just turn around and sign amendments.
You get scope creep from a variety of areas, and this is just going to be a document and a point of time that says this is what we've agreed to, this is what we're going to build, this is what you've communicated to us you need.
So I want to touch on something we've talked about a little bit, you know, in the last or during the show, and that's the difference between owned property by the state and leased property. And it looks like some of the numbers I have here, the cost of owned office space is just under $17 per square foot typically, versus leased office space is about 18.5. So there's about $1.50 difference per square foot, and that's based on like kind of equivalent, you know, usage patterns. So there are some advantages to leased property. What are some of those advantages over owned property, even if, you know, it's a little more expensive?
So those were averages.
Right,
so,
those are averages.
Yep.
Yeah, and buildings are going to vary quite a bit.
And so, you know, one of the advantages of lease space over owned space is when those lease rates per square foot are below average.
Right.
Because we're saving the taxpayer money in that position. I think some of the challenges for lease space is the quality of the space. When we build state-owned space, we have state standards that we try to adhere to. One of the big things, as you mentioned earlier, Pat, with history of sick buildings, that, you know, we're very fastidious about indoor air quality and ensuring that all of the HVAC systems are working properly. So anytime we're in a lease space where we have an HVAC system that isn't working properly and we don't get good reaction from the landlord that we're looking for, that may be a facility that isn't meeting our needs. And then we'll go and look elsewhere. And so that's one of the challenges for lease space. Finding appropriate, that meets our standard space in downtowns is very challenging. Parking is an enormous issue. I did not know when I took this job I was going to be the czar of parking. But
we found wonderful space in downtown Montpelier, and it was gorgeous. But then there was absolutely zero parking.
Well, that's Montpelier for you.
Yeah, and somebody at building said, "Well, there's no guarantee for parking." I said, "You tell the employees that, you get killed."
That is true, and I've had the Department of Human Resources explain that to me as well. There's no guarantee of parking, but what I strive to do is to ensure that there is sufficient parking. So this summer, when I terminated the lease on the car lot early, I did it right after the legislature left. Because I wanted to save some money, and we didn't need it. And I ran parking surveys every day with the Office of Security, and we had vacant parking spaces every day throughout the summer.
No kidding.
And so, you know, there was closed some days, but it validated the decision to remove that lease. I re-leased it for this winter, but I didn't see the necessity of leasing it over the summer and the fall, you know, a 6-month period where we could realize the savings. You know, that ended up being a controversial decision from some folks' perspective who want to park in front of the building that they work in, and that isn't always the case. Our parking is spread out in Montpelier, and sometimes you're going to have to walk, but there was spaces for everybody. It's a little more. I
don't mind the walking part. It was the no parking in this building.
Yes, no, I understand. and you know, so a couple of years ago, BGS built additional parking spaces down at the DOL, and now we're operating a shuttle system year-round.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah, and I've taken advantage of that before.
Yeah. Good.
Which is it's a great resource, because parking in Montpelier is difficult.
It is difficult. So that's where you park, and when that parking gets tight, that's when it's going to be time to enforce the parking regulations, which require state employees to have a parking tag and have it displayed. Right. And then we go through the warning notices. Fair.
So a while ago, when I was in state government, they were looking to sell a lot of buildings that perhaps weren't being used, and I heard Redstone is maybe on that list. Is the governor thinking of selling Redstone? Because I would think that's a sort of a money pit from heating and stuff, isn't it? Sort of. But that's a fabulous building.
It is a gorgeous, gorgeous historical building that is in the state inventory. It hasn't been occupied. I think they moved somebody in there temporarily after Irene. I believe the Secretary of State used to be
they were there
in that facility. You know, and there are people who support it and people who oppose it. And I get strong feelings from people about the decision to sell it, but I recommended to the governor that we sell it. The governor took a tour of the building with me. We went through it and looked at it, and he concurred with
it's not really set up for an office environment, and I would just think the heat must go straight up and out.
It's an expensive building to operate and maintain. It's historical, and the governor and I both agreed that somebody from the private sector who has probably some more money than the state of Vermont to invest in that. We would never have the money to bring that building up to its proper condition.
It would be beautiful if it was brought back to life like that.
We just don't have the money to invest in that, because we have these treatment, this big report that we delivered to the legislature this year that really talks about the needs of vulnerable Vermonters and not having the proper services.
And then we're going to spend money on
And we're going to spend money on historical buildings. So, this is the power of those three goals, coming into play as I evaluate, do I need to put all $5 million into a historical building to bring it up to its standard, or should we be spending $5 million, because that's what we're spending on mental health services in the capital bill.
Sort of a no-brainer when you talk about it like that.
Well, it is, and that's why these are good guideposts for all of the commissioners and secretaries to understand, how these things measure. Because you're always prioritizing in state government. There's not enough to provide what we would like to provide and what the public wants us to provide, so we have to make choices and prioritize, and this is just one way we do it.
We've saved the best for last.
Well, I was going to say, like, that leads right into another question, which is historical buildings, right? And and there's a number of historical buildings that are kind of in the in
complex.
Well, there's the Capitol complex, that's really a museum. But there's a number of those buildings. Like, what does that look like? What kind of facilities are there around the state that the state owns?
Well, you've got the Pink Lady.
Historic.
So in the Capitol complex, which a lot of people don't understand, is a designated geographic area within the city of Montpelier that is under the control of the Capitol Complex Commission, which is appointed by the governor. And all decisions regarding all state buildings have to go through this body to get approved. And so anytime we do work on a state building in Montpelier that's within the complex, we need to bring to them the plans. And they're mostly concerned about the exterior of the buildings and maintaining their historic significance. We have historical buildings in Montpelier, and so they hold our feet to the fire to maintain them in a correct way. The State Historic Preservation Officer gets involved with what we're going to do with state buildings. The state curator, David Sheets, who is an employee of BGS, gets involved in what we're going to do. So we have lots of people watching over the historic buildings in Montpelier, and I think we do a great job of taking care of them. Statutorily, I am required to give greater care in feeding to the State House. And, you know, that is a working building. That is our state government in action for 4 months out of the year. And then the other 8 months, it's a living museum.
Right.
You know,
and David, seriously,
he loves his
he's
job.
such a treasure.
Yeah.
Oh, he does.
Yeah.
And he knows that building and knows the history of that building and knows the history of all the artwork that's in the building.
We did a show with David about a year ago, and we just kept the cameras rolling, and he just went on forever.
You only have to ask him one question.
In his face that he just loves it.
Yes.
He's so passionate about it. But you take care of the grounds, the incredible flowers that are in the centerway there.
We're going to have the same colored tulips next year because I loved them so much this year.
Good job.
It was an orange and purple that, for whatever reason, they worked really.
You get a good view out of your window too.
I go and inspect everything. Yeah. So, you know, it's fascinating as you transition from one job to the next. When I was working at the Agency of Transportation, I would notice the condition of roadways and notice hazard trees and notice all kinds of things.
Right.
You know, because that's what you're responsible for. Now, you know, I just hope that they have the road plowed and I'm not noticing all the rest of that stuff. I'm just like every other Vermonter. But now I notice the condition of our buildings. I notice what's wrong, what are tripping hazards.
Well, I was in DMV when a whole slab of concrete
fell
came
from the
down,
exterior of the building.
missed the guy by about 2 inches.
Oh, no.
And I think if he had hit him, it wouldn't have been good. Came down.
That's a project that's going to be coming up in the next year's capital bill, is replacing those exterior slate facades.
Who would have known?
Yeah.
You know?
It's crazy. Well, we have about a minute left, but here's an important question is, when are we going to have to replace the gold plating on the dome?
That's happening this summer.
Oh, is it? Oh, I love watching that. It's incredible.
You can tell when it starts getting a little thin and you can see.
It's getting very thin, like good Yankees. We got an extra 20 years out of that. It's supposed to be replated every 20 years.
It's been 40.
It's been 40. So we definitely got our value out of the last gold leaf. We put that out to bid. We have a contractor.
Excellent.
Engelberth Construction will be the managing that contract, and we hope to have people in the day the legislature leaves to begin erecting that scaffolding.
That was an incredible one. I think they had a volunteer. It wasn't a full-blown redo, but when I was working at DMV, they had somebody up there patching and volunteered to do something. But it was just the scaffolding alone is fabulous. Watching them do this.
We're also going to be replacing Ceres.
Oh wow!
No! A new statue.
The goddess, a new statue. We'll be putting out a call to artists to carve a new statue.
What's happening to the statue? Is she going somewhere else?
She is failing at the base. So rot was detected 20 years ago.
Falling through wouldn't be good, would it?
No, I don't think she'd follow through, but we don't want her to fall off.
Oh, wow.
And so as long as we're going to be doing all this work and having the scaffolding up there, and because we know she has problems, we're going to go ahead and commission a new Ceres to watch over the agriculture and the people.
Well, we have brilliantly run out of time, and we want to thank you very much, Chris. I'm sure everybody learned a lot.
Thank you.
Come back anytime you have anything great to share with us. I don't know how you do your job. Good job. Thank you for tuning in. I'm sure you've learned a lot. And till next week, keep listening beyond the sound bites.